Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the Chairman and CEO of MGM Resorts International, Mr. Jim Murren.
Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to Park Theater. Welcome to Las Vegas. Welcome to the home of Lady Gaga, Bruno Mars, Aerosmith, and of course tonight, President and Secretary Clinton. I am honored to be here tonight to represent Las Vegas and the men and women of MGM Resorts International, 80,000 strong, 50,000 of which are here in Las Vegas. Our company, oh, I have an employee. Our company is proud to embrace the values the Clintons have spent a lifetime championing. The access to affordable health care. The imperative that we be great stewards of our environment. And of course, because the majority of my employees are minorities, diversity and inclusion. The Clintons, you see, have not only championed these values, but they've put in the hard work of making it happen. They've dedicated not one, but 2 lifetimes of service to our nation, and for that, we are all very grateful. This evening, we will hear from the Clintons, and we will be moderated by my friend, Jan Jones Blackhurst of Caesars. She will take us through a journey that the Clintons have lived, a Clinton journey of service that has benefited not only all of us here today, but of generations to come. So please join me in welcoming not only Jan Jones Blackhurst, but of course, President and Secretary Clinton to the stage. Thank you.
Well, I was going to begin my comments by saying I was unabashedly very, very, very pro-Clinton, but I think I have a crowd that joins me with that. And I admire them both for so many reasons, not the least of which is their extraordinary intellect, the passion to lead, the commitment to responsible public policy, their remarkable careers, and incredible courage. I want everyone just to think for a minute what we have on this stage tonight. The wealth of knowledge, where they've been, what they've seen, what they've built. Having this conversation is a conversation of a lifetime. So I hope we all know as we begin this journey just how important it is. So I was sitting in the green room and I'm looking at my notes, and all of a sudden someone says, well, this is Kim and James. And I look up, oh, it's James Taylor. And I'm, you'd think just being with Bill and Hillary I'd be speechless, but I'm going, it's James Taylor. And so I asked him, what question would you ask? And he had many, but one that I thought was really interesting was, do you think that today it's a political strategy to divide the country, almost along the historical lines of the Civil War? Is it a way you keep one party or another in power or out of power? Either of you.
That's a very good James Taylor question. And first, Jan, thank you so much, and we're thrilled to be here in Las Vegas, and thank you all for coming out tonight. And as you might guess, Bill and I have strong feelings about this question because we think that what's unfortunately happening now is a political strategy that is absolutely meant to divide and distract and divert and demonize parts of our country, parts of our people for political advantage. And I find it so heartbreaking because we've made so much progress. We have made so much progress over the years, and yet we sadly,
wherever you are, go away.
We sadly have people who would rather yell than talk and listen. What is happening? And, you know, I do think that the effort to intimidate, to marginalize, to scapegoat people is not in the best interests of our country. And so from my perspective, what we have seen over the last several years is truly deplorable.
Let me just add something to that. First of all, thank you. Jan was the mayor of Las Vegas when I ran for president. And I didn't think she was old enough to be mayor at the time. That was back in the dark ages, you know. That's back when people still actually talked to each other and listened and had conversations. But look, I'm a white Southerner. I come from what is now the president's base. You know, a small rural town and all of that. And it's not exactly the same as the Civil War, but it's a sort of an updated strategy for what happened in the reaction to Reconstruction, where we went back to divisive tribalism. Look, we're all in tribes. We cheer for our sports teams. We're proud of our heritage, all of that. The question is, will it make us stronger or weaker? It will make us stronger only if we think our common humanity matters more. Because diverse groups make better decisions than homogenous ones, as we see every single day, right? And I love this place. My beloved mother spent the last weekend of her life in Las Vegas. And she died on the day she turned 70 years and 6 months. She'd been ill a long time, was getting 2 blood transfusions a day. I said, well, look, I said, Mother, you've at least got to come to the White House for one Christmas in '93. She said, I will if you promise to get me home in time to go to Vegas to hear Barbra Streisand's concert. And she just lived every last minute of her dwindling life. And she raised me not to resent other people's success and to look for the good in people. We don't do that much anymore. And I think that this thing we're going through is a function of resentment. And it's fueled by the information ecostructure, by the economics of making money in the media, by all kinds of things. And it's no way to run a railroad. And I think if you look at why Nevada generally and Las Vegas in particular have been doing well and recovered relatively quickly from that horrible crash in 2008, it's because of your burgeoning diversity and the fact that you just figure out what you want to do and then go do it. It's a place of opportunity. And so that's my advice. I think, all this sort of, screaming at each other and calling each other names, it may be emotionally satisfying, but you'll be hungry again in 30 seconds. Because no matter how long you feed that beast, it'll never make you full. And nothing good is going to happen for our kids.
You sort of touched on it. Nevada has always seen something in both of you. I don't think either of you have ever lost an election in Nevada. So beyond just our good judgment, is it a function, we're sort of seen as the collective of the 21st century, the combination of diversity and changes. Do you think that we really do represent what the voting public could look like in the future, and does that make a difference, and how do you?
Well, I do think that. And before we came here for the event, we stopped by to see our great friend Harry Reid. And you know, I was privileged to serve in the Senate with him and under his leadership. And we were talking about the changes in Nevada because Nevada has become increasingly diverse. And it's nearly a 50% minority, 50% white majority. It's nearly even, according to Harry's telling of it to us. And so part of what's happened in Nevada is what's happening in America. And it should be celebrated, not feared. It should be recognized, as Bill said, leading to more energy and optimism. Las Vegas and Nevada could not run without immigrants. And a lot of the immigrants who I had the pleasure to get to know over the years are hardworking people. They are dedicated family people. They are small business startup people. They are students. They are dreamers. They represent the best of all of us. And so when I look at Nevada today and see the incredible, energetic embrace of the future and the desire to really make one's way and to create a better opportunity, I'm thrilled. So I think Nevada is on the cutting edge. I think Nevada is a place that is helping to lead the way for America if we are willing to go into the future with confidence rather than to try to shrink back to the past with fear and insecurity. And I hope we choose the future.
If only we were the size of California, but we're growing.
But you should. But there are versions to that. Yep. That is, you still have a Governor Mueller is here. I served with him, and I've enjoyed it very much. And I remember when I came here, and I went to see Brian Greenspan when I first came to Nevada because we went to college together, and he was a newspaper editor. And I thought, dear God, if I went to college with somebody who endorsed the other guy, I'm toast. And I'll never do well in Nevada. Nobody will care how much my mother loved Las Vegas. And there was an attempt to put a nuclear waste out here. You remember that?
Mm-hmm. Yucca Mountain. They're trying to bring it back.
Some of the nuclear waste was going to come from nuclear power plants in Arkansas, my native state. And the utility was desperate to offload it because we were storing it there. There were no suitable sites. I'll never forget this. There were 3 sites studied. The salt domes in Louisiana, a big place in West Texas, and a place south of Vegas. You remember where it was. And I had a member of my administration who served on the committee that was supposed to review the sites. So I called her and I said, you know, this Vegas site is closer to an earthquake fault than the one in Texas. And I think that the majority of the committee is voting for it because they think Las Vegas will never vote for a Democrat under any circumstances, Nevada, and they think that there are fewer electoral votes here than there are in Louisiana or Texas. And I don't think we ought to make the decision that way, even if we have to hold our nuclear waste for another couple of years. It ought to be made. And I will always respect, I'll give a shout out to Brian. He did not ask me to come out against citing. All he said was, promise us you'll do it on the merits. It's the only thing anybody in Nevada ever asked me to do. Do it on the merits. And I studied it, and I thought it was a bad deal. And I said so. But why am I telling you this? There's something to be said for having a social experiment that is small enough in number for lots of people to know each other, even when they have disagreements and they work through things. So I still believe that Las Vegas should become the solar capital of America. I still think you can diversify your economy even more than you have, and I think that you will be the wave of the future as long as you practice inclusive, not divisive tribalism, including for the Native Americans, the growing Asian community, the vibrant African American community. This is a really interesting place. There's nearly somebody here from nearly any place on earth now.
Exactly. So during your careers, you've helped innumerable people get ahead with their own careers. I know that, Hillary, you came to Nevada when I was running for governor in 1997 to support me. And when I lost, the president called me to say, we're sorry, but thank you for running. Do you know what it's like to pick up the phone and have someone say, oh, the White House is on the line? But it was a really meaningful gesture. And it seems like today that politics is becoming just transactional. There's no loyalty. Nobody's paying it forward. Is that something that is a real danger, not only for the country, but for the political process as we know it?
Well, Jan, I think it is, because it goes hand in hand with not really seeing people and the impact of your decisions on people. Because if you don't care about people you actually know, then why would you care about, somebody 2, 3, 4 times removed? And if you don't know the stories of the people who you ask for votes or that you talk to and listen to about their lives, then everything is disposable. It's not only transactional, because we all are transactional to a certain extent. Like, I want to do this and you want to do that. How do we come together? But if you view people as disposable, if you run businesses to basically take out every penny you can get out of it, regardless of the employees, regardless of the communities, that's no different than being in politics. And you take advantage of people, or you use people. If you are a person in public life who is only in it for yourself, for your own ego, for your own power, and you don't care about the people that you're either serving or elected to represent, that erodes democracy. Not everybody's a saint. Not everybody, is pure. Politicians are human beings like all the rest of us. But if you really, at the end of the day, don't care, then you have undermined what holds democracy together, because it's such a fragile relationship, and it has to be held together by trust. You have to at least trust that your leaders care about you. You have to trust that people are going to be making the right decisions more often than not. And so I think it's a very important observation, and it's one that worries me, because I don't recognize some of the people that I served with in the Senate now that are on the other side of the aisle. I served with them. I worked with them. I, wrote legislation with them. And now they just seem to be so uncaring, so oblivious of what's actually going on in the lives of a lot of people. And there's many examples of that, but whether it's climate change, which poses a real threat to our futures, or whether it's ripping children away from their families at our border, you can't do those things or fail to do those things if you're really thinking about people. And so that means you have to have relationships, real relationships with people.
Oh, you don't have a comment. Well, so I hate it when he does that. So it always amazed me when I was in public office and today. People love to hate politics. They hate politics, they hate politicians, but if you really drill down, they have no idea who represents them, who's their city councilman, who's their county commissioner, who's in their state assembly, who's their congressman or woman. And in the last municipal elections in Las Vegas, 8% of the public turned out to vote. So this disdain for elected office is beginning to manifest itself in people not caring. Two questions. How dangerous is that? And second, there are 11 countries that require where voting is a law. And if you don't vote, you're either fined or penalized in some way. Is it time that we looked at that kind of requirement?
Well, first of all, yeah, if you have very persistently low turnout, it's dangerous. And I'll tell you what the most dangerous part of it. My guess is that the American culture would rebel against the requirement to vote. And if what the Supreme Court did on the health care law is any indication, they'd probably repeal it anyway. But it's interesting, as soon as they got out the requirement for people to buy insurance, then the public changed and they wanted to keep the health insurance going.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, I'll never forget that. It was a very interesting lesson in human psychology, the way Americans think. But our biggest problem with non-voting that has significant consequences on America is that the midterm turnouts tend to be lower than the presidential year turnouts, and tend to be very different. That is, they tend to be older, whiter, more Republican. Young people tended not to vote at midterm. That was all reversed in 2018. And I hate to give him credit, but I think partly it was because people finally answered President Trump's second question in his campaign. What have you got to lose? Well, he showed us. And so, and people were worried about losing their health insurance, people with pre-existing conditions, not being able to cover their kids anymore. I could go on and on and on. And there were lots of other problems. So all of a sudden we had this humongous turnout, almost presidential levels, and the distribution was more or less like it was in the general election in 2016, but more so. Even more young people turned out. Everybody said, we know what we got to lose now. And the other thing that happened was that I think beginning with Stoneman Douglas, the killing of those kids in Florida, the sensible gun laws became a voting issue for the people who support them and not just for the people who oppose them. So we had this amazing election. Our party had 65 new members, 25 replaced Democrats, 40 replaced Republicans. Those people won because they were interesting, committed, concerned. They listened to their voters, they were close to them, and they're still trying to be close to them. So I think that if we can stand and deliver now, even if we don't pass our bills through the Senate, if we do the things that the people who won those Republican seats said they'd do, and get them through the House of Representatives, I think we'll continue to have good voting turnout in midterms. We have now learned, it was amazing to me, both when I was president and even more after President Obama got in. He got really good publicity all the time, and a lot of young people who supported him just said, well, we got a president, we don't have to show up at midterms. And by not showing up, they were tying his hands. And then the Republicans realized that people thought the only thing that mattered was who the president was, so they blamed him for not doing things they stopped him from doing. Which they do have a certain chutzpah about them. You got to admit that takes some real gall, but they did. And they're good at this kind of stuff. I noticed the other day, the president had been in office 2 years and a month. And the House organ for the Trump administration is the New York Post, Rupert Murdoch's newspaper in New York, and there was a headline, I'm not making this up, he's been in office 25 months. Trump recovery enters 100th month. That was the headline. No one can say it's not his now. So now I think we know we got to show up. And if young people who have more tomorrows than yesterdays will show up at the same rate that people in our age group do, and younger people than us, which is sadly nearly everybody now, I think this will work itself out. I think we'll be fine. We have some other problems, but and the same thing is true at the local level. There are two reasons for not voting. One is bad and one is good, or one is not bad at least. And the one that's not bad is if people think the people are doing a good job and they're perfectly happy and they think Vegas is running well and why I got other things to do today. That's not devastating to democracy. The other is I have no idea what they do or whether it affects my life and I can't be bothered. That is bad. So I think in general, our goal should be to tell people who do show up for the presidential races that they need to show up for all the others too. Because we have by constitutional design, there's a separation of powers at the national level and a separation of responsibility at the national, state, and local level. And if you really want government to work best, you have high turnout levels for everything, and that way you get the best people running, and you're more likely to elect the best people to serve.
It's almost, I think, 9 years ago to today that Secretary Clinton was sitting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, when they announced the raid on bin Laden and the execution of bin Laden. Can you tell us, what was that like?
Wow. Well, first, I was a senator from New York on 9/11, and I had the daunting, overwhelming responsibility of going on September 12th with my colleague Chuck Schumer to New York to see what had happened and to begin working with other elected officials and law enforcement and intelligence experts to protect New York and to try to figure out what we did from then on. So I had the experience of being in the sky when there were no commercial airlines and there were fighter jets overhead in New York and flying over Ground Zero and seeing the devastation that had happened. And I spent much of my time in the Senate over the following years trying to help the people who had been injured, the families, the thousands of families who had lost a loved one, the devastation of New York. And so this was incredibly real and personal for me. And so when I served as a senator, I was on the Armed Services Committee, and I was very focused on what could be done to bring bin Laden to justice. And then when I was asked by President-elect Obama to be Secretary of State, one of the things I asked him is if trying to track down bin Laden would be a priority, and he assured me it would be. So early in 2010, after the Obama administration had been in office for about a year, Leon Panetta, the director of the CIA, came over to the State Department to see me and told me that the CIA had been collecting intelligence, and they had their first real lead that they'd had in years, and that the president wanted me to join a small group to try to analyze the intelligence and make a recommendation to him. And that's when we started these intense meetings, very small group of us, couldn't tell anybody, and it was incredibly difficult because although there was some intelligence, it was by no means, so obvious that everybody could say, okay, yes or no. So we had to keep going back, keep trying to pull it apart, getting other analyses done. So at the end of this, several weeks of work, the president wanted to know what each of us thought, and we had disagreed among ourselves. And I thought that was a really good sign. Beware of any leader, especially a president, who only wants people who agree with him or tell him what they think he wants to hear. And so we had looked at what action could be taken if we were going to recommend anything to the president, and there was differences of opinion. People thought it would be far too dangerous to go into Pakistani territory to launch a raid, so therefore they recommended bombing from a Predator drone or from a naval vessel in the Indian Ocean with a guided missile, or obviously trying to do a raid. And what I was so impressed by was how the Special Forces commander at the time, Admiral McCraven, assured all of us that they would take every precaution and they would look at every possible contingency. So when it came time and the president sitting at the head of the table in the Situation Room and about 8 of us are going around providing our recommendation, I recommended that he go ahead and do the raid. Then he had to think hard. He took a night to sleep on it, and the following day he said that he was going to order the raid. So the picture that you see in the Situation Room where we're sitting there is on that Sunday, hours behind the time in Pakistan where it was a moonless night, and the helicopters had to leave Afghanistan, evade Pakistani radar, land at the compound. The SEALs had to get out. They had to get into the compound. All of this was happening, with just split-second precision, but one of the helicopters clipped its tail on the wall going into the courtyard, and we knew that that was a likely disabled helicopter that would not leave the site, but one of the contingency plans was to have other helicopters nearby, so one was sent on the way. We were able to see this until they went into the compound buildings, and then we couldn't see anymore, and then we got word that there'd been a sighting of bin Laden and that he had been killed, along with 2 security guards and one of his adult sons. So people are starting to wake up. We're monitoring all of this, and we know people are waking up. People are wondering what's going on. The site is about a mile from the Pakistani Military Academy, so we had no idea whether there'd be a response from the police, from the military. So really, time was totally of the essence. They had to get the body out, get everybody loaded back. And here's one thing I want to just mention, because it made such a big impression on me. They had to blow up the helicopter because they couldn't leave it to be discovered and to have it analyzed with the avionics, the technology that it had. But before they blew it up, they took the women and children out of the building. And remember, these are the wives and children of Al-Qaeda terrorists and the most wanted terrorists in the world. They took these women and children out and around the other side of the compound so they would be as far away from the helicopter when it blew up as they could be, so they wouldn't be injured. And then the SEALs, took off and got back across the border and made the positive identification. It was one of the best examples of good presidential decision-making that I think we've ever had in our country.
And, Mr. President, how did you find out about the raid?
Well, first of all, I agree with what Hillary said. The easy questions are easy to answer. The hard questions require people who differ. And one of the things that I'm looking at this picture, there were two people who didn't favor the operation. They made valuable contributions. And they knew that they could trust the President of the United States not to punish them if he made a decision different than they recommended. And this is very important because we're living in an atmosphere now where, you know, everybody's so afraid of having judged wrong. I do not ever want to vote for anyone who never made a mistake. Ever. I want people who make decisions. So you got these really able people there. Anyway, as soon as the thing was done, the president picked up the phone and called President Bush because he was president on 9/11, and he called me because he knew how hard I tried to get bin Laden and how I told him that bin Laden was a much bigger problem than Saddam Hussein would ever be. So he was kind enough to call me. And I should say that all the presidents are entitled, former presidents, to get CIA briefings every day. We keep our top secret clearances for life. But I never took them because Hillary was on the Armed Services Committee, then she was Secretary of State. I did jobs for the United Nations around the world. I went to North Korea to bring 2 women home for the U.S. government. I just didn't want to have anything in my head unrelated to whatever security job I was doing. So I didn't. So President Obama called me and says, "We got him." And I said, "Who?" And he said, "Bin Laden. Hillary didn't tell you?" I said, "Mr. President, you told her not to tell anybody, didn't you?" He said, "Yeah, but," I said, "she didn't tell anybody." Now, why am I telling you this? She made the absolute right decision not to tell me. I had no need to know. I had no contribution to make to the decision. But when a certain FBI director who didn't know what he was talking about said that Hillary was careless with the national security, I almost threw up. I thought, the one thing that even her critics will tell you is she ain't ever been careless about anything. But, it was 2016. We can badmouth anybody we want. We can say anything we want. It made me sick. And I have consumed more intelligence than just about anybody that voted in that election. And the idea that they said that this email thing, which did not even violate State Department rules, was the most serious problem since the end of World War II, was a lie. It wasn't overblown. It was a lie. And it was done.
Hear, hear.
It was done with the deliberate intention of making people think less of her so they'd have a closer race. The people who did it weren't necessarily trying to tip the outcome of the race in the beginning. They just thought, we can play games with democracy. Don't you ever do that, any of you. And so all these Americans go to the polls. Do they know that more recently retired 4-star military officers endorsed her than any Democrat since World War II? Did they know? No. Did they know that more Democratic, Republican, and independent career national security people endorsed her than any candidate in the history of the United States? No. And so it's funny. Yeah, I said who. But that who tells you a lot. And so when you go home tonight, you need to know that she was never careless with anybody's security, especially yours. Otherwise, I don't have strong feelings about this subject.
So staying in sort of the same venue, I don't know if any of you have missed the interview with Rachel Maddow and Mrs. Clinton. I suggest that you go and watch it. But one of my favorite outcomes is they're discussing how Barr and the president are obsessed with everything Hillary. They're still investigating her, even when he's president. And Hillary says, quote, "I'm living rent-free inside of Donald Trump's brain." And it's not a very nice place to be, I can tell you that.
I'd rather pay the mortgage somewhere else.
And then you said, when in doubt, go after me. She's head of the Republican Party strategy. Talk a little bit about the Mueller report, Barr, that
Right.
impeach,
Well, look,
not impeach.
Yeah, look, I think that we saw very clearly when Barr testified that he has assumed the role of the president's defense attorney, not the attorney general for the entire country. And I think that is incredibly dangerous. And he said many things that were, I thought, untrue, legally untrue. He said, for example, that you couldn't be charged with obstruction of justice unless there were an underlying crime. That is not true. He also made the outrageous claim that if the president decided he didn't feel that he should be investigated, you can't investigate him. Now, I had the bizarre experience, as some of you may know, of being on the impeachment inquiry staff in 1974 investigating Richard Nixon. And it was done with the greatest professionalism. Republican lawyers, Democratic lawyers, all working together, not as party members, but as professionals. So I know that it's important to be very, very careful and deliberate with this tool from the Constitution. But I believe strongly that the behavior described in the Mueller report needs to be further investigated so that the American people can know what happened. There are two major conclusions from that report, and most Americans, don't have the time to read that long report, but there are two things you should know. The first is that the Russians interfered in a sweeping and systemic way in the election. That is not at doubt. It is demonstrated conclusively in the Mueller report. Names, places, directions, it is all there. So anyone who tries to tell you the Russians were not involved either doesn't know, doesn't care, or is trying to divert your attention. In fact, the FBI director appointed by this president just recently said that the Russians are still in our election systems, and we have to be watchful about what will happen in 2020. The second big conclusion is that this president obstructed justice. He tried to interfere with that investigation. So what I would like to see, and what I recommended that Congress do, is pursue investigations into all of these issues, unanswered questions about what happened, call the people who are mentioned in the Mueller report to testify in front of committees so that the American people can see it. That's what happened in Watergate. There were hearings, and those hearings had people testifying and answering questions and educating the American people about what came to be charges against President Nixon. So I feel really strongly that Bill Barr is trying to divert attention, trying to obfuscate the findings in the Mueller report. And if you watched any of his appearance, I mean, starting with the very first questions from the Republican chair of the Senate committee, probably talked more about me than they did about the Mueller report. And, it sort of is a perverse form of flattery that these guys cannot get over me. But it just shows you how bankrupt they are, because they do not take seriously the very oath that they swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States. and to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed. And that is what is most troubling to me. You know, they've been going after me for 25 years, and it really annoys them that I'm still standing. And so...
Well, let me say, I would like to make 2 points. But first, Hillary's article about this, and she talked about it on Rachel Maddow, she said, we have good committees, we have smart people, they need to see this through to the end. And then the rest of the Congress needs to pass the agenda so people know we're not spending all our time doing this, we're also trying to do what we promised to do in the election. I think it's important to do both. Second thing I want to say is, because we're in Vegas, that Donald Trump and his father's first political advisor was a man named Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was the chief political strategist for Senator Joe McCarthy. When Brian Greenspun's dad was running the newspaper here, Joe McCarthy came to Las Vegas, and Hank Greenspun stood up against him, and he was a Republican. Back when standing up for your country was not a partisan issue. And he said, shame on you. And Roy Cohn had a theory about how you should handle this, which when McCarthy went home in disgrace to Wisconsin, he transferred to New York. And it is, never deny, always attack, and accuse someone else of doing what you're doing. Whatever it is you're doing, accuse somebody else of doing it. And a lot of people will believe it, and nobody will ever get to the truth. And we had too many intermediate institutions, and things happened too slow for him to get away with that then. But now things happen so fast, you got a better chance of doing that. That's all that's going on now. They're doing, you know, what they've been doing for decades in business and other contexts. And I think it's really important that when you get on the social media, even if it's something you think you agree with, you be very careful before you immediately believe any kind of personal attack against someone, because there is just so much garbage out there. And we got to see this through. I want to make one other point about the Russians being in the system. Dan Coates, who's what's his official title? Yeah, he's the director of national intelligence, former Republican senator from Indiana. Last year, I wrote a book with James Patterson called The President is Missing. And it's about, thank you, it's sold well, and thank you for that. But it's about an attempt to hack America, to shut everything down. While we were out promoting the book, Dan Coates said, he was appointed by President Trump, Dan Coates said, the Russians have penetrated the electrical grid in America. They just haven't pulled the trigger yet. And they may be waiting until they can fry the transformers as well as turn the lights out. They may be holding it over our head. They may be 1,000 things. But when I remember the first time Hillary said her people believed that the Russians were messing with our elections, even I didn't know what to believe. But I thought I ought to take it seriously because I trusted the computer folks she had working. Nobody took it seriously. Take this seriously. Believe me, cybersecurity is going to be one of the great challenges of your life for the next 20 years at least. This is serious, and it shouldn't be Republicans or Democrats. Last time I checked, both of us turned the lights on with the same kind of switches. I mean, you can laugh. It's elections today. It's something else tomorrow. We have got to protect ourselves better than we are. This is not a partisan issue. This is an American issue.
I'm going to get back to Vladimir Putin, but first I'm going to go back to your mother for a minute. When I was mayor of Las Vegas, the president told you, Virginia loved Las Vegas. So I met her, and we became friends, and she invited me to Little Rock the night that President Clinton was elected. And huge night, President and First Lady left, and I was sitting with Virginia and her husband, Dick, and there may have been 6 or 7 other people at the table. And she was sitting there, and she said, you know what? She goes, it looks like room service is closed, but I'm hungry. And a woman sitting there said, you are now the mother of the President of the United States. You can get anything you want. And without missing a beat, she said, I could get anything I wanted long before I was mother of the President of the United States. True story. But it makes me, you're talking about, they've been investigating you for the last 25 years. They didn't like you when you didn't bake cookies. They did like you when you did bake cookies. They didn't like you when you went to work. When I was mayor, in fact, Brian Greenspun said tonight, he said when you spoke at UNLV, he brought you a pair of running shoes because you were running. And he said, you should bring a sledgehammer. I said, Brian, where am I going to find a sledgehammer to talk about breaking glass ceilings? And when I was running for mayor, there were over 15 ethics violations filed against me, front page headlines. All of them were found to be without merit. But when I ran for governor, they were used, and I think at the end they were really much of the reason why I was defeated. We've watched them do the same thing to you over and over again. So question for both of you. Is that politics fair game, or is there a bit of misogyny that it's easier to beat up on a woman and people will accept it than just beating up on a candidate?
Well, I have given some thought to this.
I'll betcha.
And look, politics is a contact sport, as Bill always says. You have to expect it to be rough and tumble, and it certainly has been in my experience, but I think that's part of the overall understanding of the way the political system works. However, that doesn't mean that people should be able to get away with constantly lying about you and undermining you and impugning your character and making up nonsense about you. And that happens to both male and female candidates, but it has been my observation that there's a double standard. And the double standard goes to the expectations people have about women candidates or women office holders, and the way that the same thing can be viewed differently. I was not the only person in the government who used a personal email. I was not the only person in the government who, when out of office, made speeches that I was paid for. But when I was attacked on those things, that was all anybody heard, that I had done something that somehow was viewed as unusual, different, wrong, however it was characterized. And I do think that Benghazi is a perfect example. Very brave Americans, both military and civilians, died in attacks under every president and every Secretary of State. And when this terrible attack happened in Benghazi, I immediately said, let's investigate it and let's make sure we learn from it and make the findings public. And there were 7 investigations run by Republican committees in the House and the Senate, all of whom said, we can do better here. They were productive. They were about trying to figure out what happened. It was like after the terrible bombings of the embassies in Africa when Bill was president, or the terrible bombings of the Marine barracks and the embassy in Beirut when Ronald Reagan was president. these terrible things happen, and so you're supposed to figure out, what do you do to make sure it doesn't happen again? That was my immediate reaction. So all these other committees are investigating, and they all say, we need to, figure out what to do better. But then the Republicans create a committee solely to investigate that and solely to investigate me. And I testified for 11 hours in front of that committee, and the real story was not at all about trying to find out anything that could help save a life. It was about trying to tear me down. And in fact, Kevin McCarthy, the current minority leader in the House, said, yeah, that's what it was for, and look how it worked. So there is an element that women are held to a higher standard and at the same time are judged more harshly. So if you are in business, if you're in politics, academia, media, that just kind of is part of the background. The final thing I want to say is that when I wrote this book after the election, What Happened, I have a chapter called Women in Politics, because I wanted to try to explain to people what I thought this double standard was. And I used current examples, not what happened to me, but what was happening to other women office holders. And now in this campaign where we have women running, we're seeing some of the same thing. So it is unfortunately still true that sexism and misogyny are alive and well in our political system, and women are held to a higher double standard and often more harshly, and we've got to get over that, my friends. We have to be judging people fairly on who they are and what they do, and then hold them accountable if there's something there, but don't make up stuff to try to tear people down, particularly to try to undermine women candidates.
First of all, I agree with that. I mean, I do agree with that. I read, we got a lot of women out there running the Democratic primary, and I've read some things that just make my blood boil. I mean, and I'm not involved in this. I don't know who I'll vote for. That's not it. It's just the way people talk about it. If you don't agree with Elizabeth Warren's issues, say you don't agree with them, at least you know where she stands. And instead, the president calls her Pocahontas. And we all think it's funny. Isn't that cute? That's not what... And I just think we got to stop that. The other thing I think you should know that makes this worse is the social media. Because there's always been about somewhere between 15 and 20% of the people kind of that we're always kind of, they'll believe anything you tell them about anything practically, as long as it's bad. Give me some dirt on somebody, please. But it never could bubble to the surface and dominate the debate before the social media. I mean, in 1992, Rush Limbaugh and all of his crowd, they accused me of murder, drug running, lots of interesting little things. And it never really went anywhere. But now, this stuff gets a lot more. I mean, a poor deluded guy drove to Washington and shot up the pizza place next to a bookstore that belongs to a woman that used to work with Hillary, because the social media said that Hillary was running a child trafficking ring out of this pizza place, because they scandalously had a small dollar fundraiser for it and raised a couple of grand, and that just proves how totally corrupt they were and where the babies they're trafficking in a pizza place. So this poor small businessman has maybe his whole life ruined because he's an opportunity for the social media. And you guys we've all got to develop some antibodies here. I mean, you got Robert Mercer, the guy that funds Steve Bannon and Breitbart. He bankrolls a guy to write a book, trashing our foundation. Next thing I know, without the readers being told, I'm reading about unedited excerpts in major newspapers because they're afraid that they'll get gun jumped by something prominent in the social media. And if it's not true, too bad. So I counted 21 separate dishonest stories just on my work in Haiti. Just on Haiti. I killed somebody down there too because I was afraid he was going to tell something to somebody. I can't quite sort it out. But you're laughing, but I'm just telling you, if you think you can subject somebody to that without it working, you're wrong. We're living in a time that until we develop antibodies to this, when a lie works better than the truth. And you've got to stop it. Your whole future depends on it.
Well, I'm just saying, you went through 11 hours of Benghazi hearings, and Attorney General Barr said he wasn't going to show up for the next meeting.
Yeah, well, look at that. And Brett Kavanaugh said he was so offended that his wife and daughter had to put up with 45 minutes of that tough hearing.
I know.
And he didn't have any problem making Vince Foster's wife and children put up with 3 years of what he knew was a total charade. And Hillary stood up there for 11 hours and didn't break a sweat. And so I actually, I have a slightly unconvinced. I think that Benghazi hearing did raise her negatives, but I also think that a lot of people watched it and thought, now that person could be president. I want somebody like that. So I think it was a net plus.
Should have been president. Winston Churchill once noted that courage is what it takes to stand up and speak, and courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. That used to always be the tenure of politics. You didn't agree, but you would have a conversation. You could get to some kind of outcome. It seems today that there is no discourse, there is no conversation, there is no middle ground. You're either with us or you're against us. Where does that go? And what does that bode for America as a democracy and America as a leader of the free world?
Well, I think people know better. I think they want something better. But we need to offer them something better, and then if you really want us to have a civil discourse again, you got to vote for people who give it to you instead of say that's what I really want, but this other person gives me so much emotional satisfaction crapping all over something I don't like. I mean, in other words, you got to, it's not enough to say what you want, you have to vote what you want. But I run this leadership program with President Bush, 43. To put it mildly, we have a lot of disagreements. We actually sometimes do speaking tours where we have arguments in front of real people. But he's not afraid of immigrants. He supported immigration reform. He's not afraid to debate with me. He would go to South Texas with me, and we could have a debate before an all-Latino audience about what's the best way to do all this stuff. And he's not afraid of that. That's the American way. And so we bring this group, 60 people together every year, young professionals between 29 and early 40s. They all have to have some project they're working on. They're more or less evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. And we meet with them, and then they go to the LBJ library and his dad's library too, and they study decision making. And then we have a graduation. At the graduation, without fail, we both do the graduation. The Republicans thank me and the Democrats thank him. Because they say, I didn't know there were any people like that. We have become so isolated and so hunkered down. We are less racist and homophobic and even sexist for all of our problems than we used to be. We just don't want to be around anybody who disagrees with us. That's our real bigotry, and that's what makes us vulnerable to a lot of this junk on the social media. And, I grew up in a storytelling culture. I was 10 years old before we had a television. My family couldn't afford we took one out-of-state vacation in my whole childhood. You couldn't tell a story until you could listen to one. We need to get back to that. Everybody's got a story, and we need to figure out how to reach down to people's innate dignity. One of the reasons I've loved all these sexual identity issues finally being raised and people being able to come out of the multiple closets is that everybody's got a story. And once you hear a person, you say, oh, I can identify with that. I don't think this person should be humiliated. Here's a person who loves the country. Here's a person who wants to serve in the military. Here's a person, you name it. That's what we need to get back to.
I don't think people have changed that much, but I think the environment in which we are operating has changed dramatically. And I don't know what to do about this, but for example, Bill's mentioned social media. The idea of social media was to actually bring us together, to share information, to meet people halfway across the world who might have interests similar to yours. And of course it's done that, but it's also furthered our divisions, and it has created echo chambers so that you communicate with and about people you already agree with. You like and you don't like the people who have some different point of view. And it's also become a battleground where people who are highly partisan or conspiracy-minded, very negative, on both the right and the left, it's not just one side, just go after each other all the time. And so if you're getting your news primarily from channels that already agree with you, then you see the world differently than somebody who's getting his or her news from a channel that agrees with them already. And it's really difficult to have a conversation when people are already in their little bubbles. And then we've got the phenomenon of Fox News, which did not exist when Bill ran for president the first time. And now, unfortunately, has become, the source of information for a significant percentage of our people who don't get the rest of the story that is happening. So I don't know how we get back to some agreed upon facts. You can't make decisions in your life, in your business, or certainly in politics in our democracy unless you have some agreed upon basis of facts and evidence. And if you don't, if you live in a fact-free zone, or if you live in a world of distorted information, then how can we come together? Let's take this really incredibly important issue of vaccination, right? Now, if you are someone who gets your information from Facebook feeds that are filled with falsehoods about vaccinations, you want to do the best for your child. And so you decide you're not going to vaccinate because you've read something that is totally untrue, by the way, but which makes you believe that your child would be at risk. Now, what does that mean? It means that we are beginning to see a measles epidemic throughout a lot of places in our country. We have a big one in New York right now, from people who thought that there were elements in the vaccines, they were told, that were against their religion. And even when their religious leaders said, no, that's not true, they believed the stuff they were reading on Facebook more than their own religious leader, more than their own pediatrician. So how do you make decisions when people have information that they are relying on, which is absolutely wrong, but which has consequences not only for their own decisions, but in the case of vaccination, for a lot of other people as well? We have got to get back to trying to have some agreed upon factual foundation to make decisions that are going to affect our lives and the lives of people in our communities and our country.
The only other thing I would say is I believe that's to be true. I also think, we're all human. We all have our opinions. But I think that the so-called mainstream news organizations, when they report on politics, have an obligation to tell people that there's a difference between a fact and an opinion. There's a lot of you have young children. We could have a fascinating debate about what's the best way to teach mathematics to young kids. And Hillary and I, we're interested in that because we got young grandkids. But we can't have a conversation if we don't agree that 2 and 2 is 4. And you can say, well, I'm sorry, it's just my opinion, as if an opinion and a fact is the same thing. And a lot of the 2016 campaign was reported that way. When Harvard University actually cataloged every article that was written and everything that was shown on television, they called it, the director of their center called it a feast of false equivalency, because they thought being fair was, if I say something bad about you that's true, I have to say something bad about her, even if it's false, and I know it's false, because that's the only way I can be seen as fair. Oh, I don't want to be criticized. Well, it's a contact sport. Suit up here. So I think that's another thing. We need to draw a sharp distinction, and if people are offering their opinions, say, have at it. Give us your opinion. But do not pretend that you have to dump on, because, the other guys, then it's, but I'd feel this way even if we had Fox, and even if we had Breitbart, and even if we had it. You just think about it. If one side is all in, and everybody else says, the only way I can be fair is to say something equally bad, equal all the time about both sides, even if I know one of them is not true, which is essentially what the email thing was. How do the voters win on that deal? You got to really be careful about this. And we'll get there, I think. The Internet's done fabulous things. Kids can find out stuff that would have taken them the Library of Congress to find out 20 years ago. It's great. You can crowdfund elections. The American people crowdfunded the Haitian earthquake, gave over $1 billion, and the median contribution was $26. I mean, you should be proud of that. I mean, you should be proud of that kind of stuff. But don't pretend our politics has been severely damaged by this sort of false equivalency of, oh, they're all bad and everything's bad. There's no difference in a fact and an opinion. You can say, look, I'm with the 20%, not with the 80%. With climate change, you can say, I'm with the 5%, not with the 95% of scientists, and here's why. But that's what you ought to say. You ought to say that there's two different facts here at war, or my opinion is just as good as yours. It's just how I feel, which is what Bill Barr said about Trump. There was lots of days when I felt things were unfair in Washington. I wish I had known when I was president. I could just dismiss them all.
Exactly.
Go away. I feel this is really bad. Go away. Go away. It would have been a heck of a job, man. I would have had so much fun.
So Vladimir Putin ascended during your presidency, and while you were Secretary of State, countless times you sat across from him at negotiating tables. The president called him to tell him he was so glad there was no problems, and that I can't even remember what he called it, something remarkable. Yes, the Russian hoax. And what do you do with that? Vladimir Putin calls for a summit with Kim Jong-un. What happens when America is not the driver? Yeah. We're just watching. What happens?
Well, we lose our leverage. We lose our strong position to influence and manage and hopefully direct events in the world. Look, I believe that Vladimir Putin is playing Donald Trump. I believe that he is very well aware of the vulnerabilities that he has in terms of his emotional makeup. You know, remember, Putin is a trained KGB agent. He understands how you manipulate people. And, you know, I stood up for America. He didn't like that. And if you read the Mueller report, you can see how determined the Russians were through their intelligence agencies, the military intelligence agency known as GRU, and all of their proxies and their, you know, their agents and their stooges and their trolls and their bots and all the rest of that, to sow discord in America. Now, their primary objective was to divide Americans against Americans, and they wanted to hurt me because they thought if they could create enough negativity toward me, they might help Trump. But even if they didn't get Trump elected, they would have a divided, weakened America. That's what it's all about for Putin. He wants a weak America, and unfortunately, our president is giving him what he wants. And that is not in the best interest of our economy, of our position in the world. And you know, there's so many problems with this because, you know, Putin is the most obvious, but Trump has a predilection toward dictators. He feels that they get things done by ordering people around, or in the case of Putin murdering those that oppose him, or the case of Saudi Arabia murdering or imprisoning those who oppose them. So he gravitates toward that. And, you know, you can be strong and tough about what we need to stand up for in America. And a lot of these tough guys on the international scene expect you to push back. You know, I had lots of encounters with Putin. And, you know, he was somebody who, like any person of his mindset, is going to push as far as he can push unless he is pushed back on. And right now, we are ceding so much territory to him, and as Bill pointed out, leaving ourselves so vulnerable. I don't understand completely, which is why I'd like to see more hearings and more inquiry into what Trump is actually doing, because I don't understand exactly the hold that Putin has over him and what it is that Putin can hold out to him. But it is not normal for the President of the United States to take private meetings with Putin and report out nothing. You know, when a president meets with another leader, if that meeting occurs, usually there's a translator, usually there's a note taker, and usually we know what was discussed and what may have been decided. We have no idea. When you make a phone call, usually there's what's called a readout. What do we know happened in the phone call that went on apparently for an hour and a half? Is that, you know, we know Putin and Trump talked about the Russian hoax being over in the face of hundreds of pages of documents, of intercepts of phone calls, of intercepts of emails, proving exactly what, unfortunately, is the case, the fact that Putin was interfering in our election. So this will be studied by historians for years, because there is much more happening here than we yet know, and Putin is, you know, just as pleased with himself as it's possible to be, because he has manipulated our election, divided our country, and has used the President of the United States for his own purposes.
Let's throw it into the present and into the future. I'll give you a couple of examples that I'm worried about. One that affects Nevada potentially a lot over the long run. President Trump said all during the campaign that NAFTA was the worst trade deal in human history and all that, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to throw it out and give you a really beautiful new one. And essentially what they did was he realized that we had a lot of at play here, so they essentially did what any administration should have done, what Hillary would have done. The thing is getting a little long in the tooth. It was negotiated in 92 and amended in 93, so they upgraded it. And there was, as far as he made because he doesn't like what Mexico does, because they can't wave a magic wand and make all those people from Central America go away. You can't run a country like that if people don't trust you to keep your own word on a deal that you did. You can't do that. Now, second thing is, I'll tell you what I think Putin wants in his heart of hearts. First of all, look what he's done. He has stayed in power. He switched from being a president to a prime minister, now back to a president. Then they just remove all pretense, and he runs, and everybody has to give him a piece of everything. And he may be the richest person in the world now. But he likes this move toward authoritarianism. I want to be fairer to the Trump administration than they are to us. I don't know why, but apparently I'm thrilled that the Trump administration doesn't seem to like the dictator in Venezuela. It's the only dictator in the world he doesn't like, but I thank God for small favors, and I hope something good happens there. But what Putin loves messing with us, because every one of you, if you didn't think your vote could be honestly counted, or even worse, if you didn't think you had any accurate information, so you couldn't decide whether to vote for Jan or Hillary for mayor of Las Vegas, then how could you believe in democracy if A, you didn't have any information you trusted, and B, you didn't think your vote would be honestly cast? They want the dictators club in the world to basically to undermine people's passion about democracy. You think about how many close races you have in Nevada. You've had a lot of close races, right? And it's thrilling, I think. You got people who are involved and who differ, and they're struggling and working through all these issues we're talking through. But they do it because they think that it matters who wins. And they think they know what they're doing. And they think their votes will be counted. Look at President Xi in China, who in many ways is much more admirable. They built a wonderful railroad in eastern China. They are trying to lead the world in the production of solar and wind power. They gave Arizona State University a place in a university partnership in China. They're doing a lot of interesting things, but they also got 1 million Uyghurs, Muslim Uyghurs, in what is essentially a modern concentration camp in northwest China. They don't like democracy. The Saudis have been our allies in the Middle East for a long time. But I think it's a bad thing. They let women drive, and then they kept the women who advocated that women drive in jail. And then Mr. Khashoggi got chopped up. So there are all these people here that just hate democracy, that hate it when the little guys can stand up and say no and actually know what they're doing. I think that's what their goal is. If he can mess with our elections 2 or 3 times, how will you ever trust it again? That's why you should care. Even if you're a conservative Republican and you think Hillary and I are nuts, you should care about that. Because if he can keep messing with it, nobody will believe you either.
To that point, there was an article in the New York Times that the economy is humming 100 months, which Trump took credit for, even though he's only been in 24, but hey, what? So you've got this vibrant economy. You've got 21 to date Democratic candidates in the primary. How does that bode for the elections? How do we win?
Well, look, I think it's, first of all, thrilling that we have so many people running, because it shows that there's a lot of energy on our side, that people want to get out there, they want to make their case, they want to distinguish themselves, but so far they've done it in a positive way. And yes, obviously the economy is always the backdrop of elections, but there are a lot of other issues that people are concerned about. So, for example, if you are a person with a pre-existing condition, and there's somewhere 130, 150 million, how many there are in our country who have a pre-existing condition. If you've lived long enough, you have a pre-existing condition. Then the fact that Donald Trump's White House has ordered the Justice Department to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which guarantees that you can't be discriminated against because of a pre-existing condition, affects you. And if they are successful in repealing the Affordable Care Act, not only the 20 million people that get their health care from the exchange, but Medicaid, which was expanded in this state, which has made a huge difference in the health and well-being of a lot of folks here, young people who stayed on their parents' policy, that's gone. So a lot which affects people who may not even be thinking about the election. They will wake up and say, wait a minute, what happened? So it's not only the economy, it's a lot of other issues. If you care about climate change, if you care about, as I hope you do, sensible, comprehensive immigration reform, if you care about, the kinds of jobs that people can get and whether or not they can succeed in them, if you care about the affordability of college, there's a long list. And this administration is on the wrong side of all of those issues. So this is going to be a vigorous election, and I think we have a really good chance.
Yeah, I just want to say something about this economy. First of all, the recovery started 8.5 years ago, and it's a long recovery. And the tax bill that the president signed, in my opinion, was mostly wasted money. There's one really good provision there which expands something that I started called the New Markets Tax Credit and gives people even more incentives to invest in areas that have been left out and left behind. I'm all for it. It was put in there, not by the administration, but by the African-American Republican senator from South Carolina and Senator Corbooker from New Jersey. And it's a good bill. But we are at 87% of the benefits of that tax bill didn't go to working class Americans. So let's not get too carried away. So let's look what we've seen. Today, the biggest news article in any of the major papers is about the staggering number of Americans who are in trouble and having to sacrifice because they can no longer afford rising deductibles in their health policy, which are rising in no small measure because of continuous uncertainty in the Affordable Care Act instead of fixing what's wrong with it and what still needs to be fixed. Two, there was an article last week in the paper that pointed out that we are at a 7-year high in the number of Americans who are 3 months or more behind in their car payments. 3, last year, median household wealth had the biggest drop, save 1 year, in 50 years. So it isn't all hunky-dory out there for real people trying to pay their bills, educate their kids, and think about the future. Our economic policy should be, we will not screw with what's working, and we will accelerate that, and we will fix what's not. And we can make a competitive election then on health care and all the things Hillary said. And by the way, you won't have to wake up in the morning every morning and wonder what new mess up we're in. You'll be able to sleep through the night. We'll take care of the economy, and we'll take care of America's challenges and opportunities in every other area. That should be our message.
So I am without, we're getting there. So without guilt, I know we've gone way past our time, but we'll never have a conversation like this again. So I hope, as I opened with, I hope all of you appreciate it.
One more thing. I know we got to quit, but I just want to say I have been thrilled to see that all these people who caused the opioid epidemic are having to pay big settlements, and we may be finally about to do something about that. You should demand that that be a major topic in this coming presidential campaign. No one should be elected president without a plan to deal better with this than we have already.
I have another James Taylor question. You've watched Trump just be so disrespectful to our allies in the UN and around the world and jeopardize our leadership. Could global warming be an issue that brings the UN and big responsible countries back together around a common...
Well, you know, Jan, it did, and that's what's so tragic. You know, there is an agreement that was reached in the Obama administration. It's called the Paris Agreement, where every country signed up to, number one, acknowledge that human activity has caused and contributed climate change, and pledging to do something about it. So we had the entire world, and it would not have happened without American leadership. And I was privileged to play a part of that when I was Secretary of State. It took enormous effort, and the UN was leading the charge, bringing everybody together. So we get the Paris Agreement, and we finally have a chance to really hammer it home. And there is so much that can be done on solar energy, which Nevada has done a lot on. Obviously, you know, any kind of renewable energy, wind, geo, whatever, and to provide incentives for it and to really make a difference. And now we're the only country not in the agreement in the entire world. And it's not like pulling out of the agreement is going to end climate change. In fact, to the contrary, it will accelerate it. And we, you know, Bill does a lot of work in the Caribbean, and we were down in Puerto Rico because they're still suffering from the hurricane damage that happened. And you can see what's going to occur because these small island nations are going to see continuing sea level rise. We're watching the ice melt at a faster rate in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. And we're watching, you know, other countries maybe even go ahead of us economically because they're making investments in clean energy. We should be leading the world in clean, renewable energy, and with all the jobs that can come from that. But we have no policy anymore, and we don't have an administration that cares about it.
Look, Pittsburgh, right? Pittsburgh, which is in the northwest part of what we now think of as coal country, right? They have more people in solar power than all the people mining coal in the states that abut them. I mean, every place in the Caribbean and Central America today could be 100% clean energy and lower their electric rates. And that reality is coming to Nevada. The solar panels are going down, the windmills are going down. You want to know, another problem with the economy is that the workforce participation rate is still not as high as it was in 1999 and 2000. But there are so many jobs we could create just by changing the way we produce and consume energy. And producing electricity is only a small part of it. I mean, the whole world is out there waiting for us. We could have an explosion in economic opportunity, enough to have the money to pay for everybody to get trained and have at least 2 years of community college, and you could do the 4 years. You could do this whole thing because we could generate so much wealth. But you can't do it by sitting around pretending the world is something it's not. You know, you have to embrace the challenges of the future.
Is that the solar is that the solar field you were talking about on our?
Is that Avanta?
Yeah.
I think it is. That's the biggest solar field in America. It's on the border of Nevada and California.
Yeah.
I've been there.
Yeah. 20 years ago, President Clinton said we could become the next Saudi Arabia.
20 years ago.
20 years ago, you said
the wind also blows a lot here up in the hills. You know, you guys are missing out on a lot. You could all have free power if you structured it right, where everybody owned a piece of it. Depends on how you do it, but you could do better.
So now that they've taken me to zero again, I think they're giving me a sign. So my final question would be, in the audience tonight, we have high school students, students from UNLV, from CSN, Teach for America. You talk about your grandchildren. I have magnificent grandchildren. What do you tell them? What should make them excited about the future? What should they look forward to? And if there's something they should protect against, what is that?
Well, first of all, I think it is the most exciting time to be alive in the history of the world. There is so much that is happening that was unimaginable a decade ago, let alone 100 years ago. And I just want young people in our country to get every opportunity you deserve to go as far and as high as your hard work and your talent will take you. Every single person deserves to have the opportunity to live up to his or her own potential. And that means the rest of us have to be sure that you have the education systems and the healthcare systems and the support systems you deserve, but much of it depends upon the direction you set for yourself. And to create the confidence that you need to move forward, you have to get an education. I mean, that is the key. It's the best insurance policy that you can have for the future. And you need to find ways to be part of something bigger than yourselves, which is immensely satisfying, but also a great growth experience. You learn when you help other people. You learn from their stories. You share your direction that maybe gives somebody else a push that can make a difference. And guard against the falsehoods that unfortunately are being used to manipulate people today. You know, don't be sold a bill of goods. Don't be encouraged to be divisive. Find ways to be inclusive. Find ways to reach out and provide more support for those not only whom you already know and agree with, but try to find people you don't agree with and figure out what makes them tick. We're going to need each and every one of you to be good citizens, you know, to make a positive contribution to our country. And I feel really optimistic about the future, even though we're going to have to fight for it. It's not going to be handed to us because there are other forces at work that really want to control you, strip back your rights, and make a very different kind of future than what I think is possible.
My only advice is this. I am very old, but I still remember what it was like to be very young. Everybody gets scared. Bad things happen to people. Sometimes people will be mean and unfair. Sometimes something that cannot possibly be explained or justified will happen. Everyone gets up every day, even I, still. Some days I'm more hopeful, some days I'm more worried. It's like every human being on earth has a little scale inside. It's your sort of soul scale, you know, and some days the dark side's weighed down, sometimes the light side's burning brighter. You should promise yourself that you will do everything you can every day to see the most, to learn the most, to love the most, and not disempower yourself. The people who are trying to make Americans mad and angry every day, trying to drive us apart, they're doing it so they can win. Don't ever, ever, ever help. I remember, you remember, every day you're mad, you belong to somebody else. Every day you stop thinking, you've given your brain to somebody else. Claim your life. Don't disempower yourself. Make the most of it. And remember, I don't care what anybody says, our differences are important. They make life interesting and exciting. But our common humanity matters more, and the older you get, the more you'll know it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Bill and Hillary Clinton, my heroes, and two of the greatest leaders America has ever seen.